The notice had been sitting on Edric's desk for 3 days before he actually wrote anything on it. It wasn't that he couldn't find the words. He sold words for a living, in a sense. Every bottle in his shop carried a label in his own hand, precise and measured, explaining exactly what the tincture did and exactly what it didn't. He'd learned early that the difference between a satisfied customer and a furious one often came down to penmanship and honesty. No, the problem was simpler than language. The problem was admitting he needed help. He sat at his workbench on the morning of the 4th day, a cold biscuit balanced on a stack of unsorted receipts, and looked at the shop around him with the particular clarity that only comes after you've tripped over the same crate of empty files for the 6th time in a week. The south wall was lined with shelving, good shelving, oak and iron, built to hold weight. But what it held now was less a system and more an archaeological record of every project he'd started and never quite put away. Dried bundles of fennel leaned against a jar of calcium powder. A half-finished distillation rig sat in the corner like a glass skeleton, its tubes dusty and disconnected. Somewhere beneath a pile of waxed cloth was a mortar he hadn't seen since winter. The floor was worse. He'd stopped noticing the floor. Edric picked up the biscuit, considered it, and set it back down. He pulled the blank notice toward him and dipped his pen. Cleaning help wanted. Alchemy shop, east end of Harrow Street. Work is steady. Applicant must be comfortable around glass, open flame, and mild chemical odor. Discretion preferred. Inquire within. He read it twice, added, after a pause, fair wage, paid daily. That last part mattered. He knew it mattered because he remembered what it felt like to wait for money owed, to watch someone else decide when your labor became real enough to compensate. His old partner, Brennan, had once made him wait 3 weeks for a split payment on a commissioned salve. Not out of malice, just out of the particular carelessness that came naturally to people who had never been genuinely short on anything. Edric didn't think about Brennan often. He thought about Brennan constantly. He let the ink dry, rolled the notice loosely, and pulled on his coat. The community board was 4 streets over, nailed to the side of a grain merchant's warehouse where the foot traffic was thick enough to matter. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the cobblestones, sidestepping a cart of winter squash and nodding once to the woman who sold candles from a basket near the fountain. She didn't nod back. She never did. He'd been buying candles from her for 2 years. The board was crowded. Harvest labor postings dominated the top half. Farms outside the city walls always needed hands this time of year, and the pay was written large enough to read from the street. Below those hung the usual assortment. A lost dog described in excessive detail, a room for let above a tannery that the listing described as characterful, 3 separate notices from the same woman seeking a husband with good teeth and no opinions. Edric pinned his notice in the lower corner, where the board met shadow. He didn't center it. He didn't make it prominent. Some part of him, the part that had lived alone long enough to mistake silence for preference, quietly hoped no one would see it at all. He walked home. He made tea. He moved the crate of empty files to the other side of the room, where he would certainly trip over it again tomorrow. The biscuit was still on the workbench. He ate it cold, standing up, watching the late afternoon light come through the shop's front window and catch the dust motes drifting above his unsorted, unswept, quietly accumulating life. Someone would answer the posting, or they wouldn't. He washed his cup. He went back to work. She arrived before the sun had fully committed to the day, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure the threshold would hold her weight. Edric noticed this because he'd been awake since 4, failing to stabilize a tincture of feverfew that kept separating no matter how precisely he measured the alcohol, and the knock had startled him badly enough that he'd spilled half of it across his sleeve. He opened the door with his arm still dripping. She was tall. That was the first thing. Not surprising. Orcs generally were. but she carried her height like an apology, shoulders drawn slightly inward, chin tucked at an angle that made her seem like she was perpetually bracing for a low ceiling. Her skin was the grey-green of river moss after rain, and her tusks were modest, curving just past her lower lip in a way that made her look like she was always on the verge of saying something she'd decided against. "The posting," she said, "on the board near the Chandlers. For cleaning." "Right." He looked at his sleeve, looked at her, looked at the catastrophe behind him that had, at some point in the last 6 weeks, stopped being a workshop and started being an argument between gravity and his filing system. "It's still available." "I can see that." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he stepped aside and let her in, and watched the way her eyes moved across the room, not with the glazed horror most visitors displayed, but with a kind of careful inventory. She was cataloguing, sorting things into mental categories he couldn't see. Her gaze paused on the workbench, on the shelves, on the stack of crates near the back wall that he'd been meaning to unpack since the previous autumn. Then her eyes found the biscuit. It sat where it always sat, on the corner of the workbench nearest the window, half hidden behind a mortar and pestle. He'd put it there this morning out of habit, pulled one from the tin, set it down, forgotten it in favor of the feverfew. It was already going cold. It was always going cold. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually eaten one while it was still warm. She looked at the biscuit for exactly 2 seconds too long, and in those 2 seconds Edric understood something he wasn't prepared to understand, so he set it aside in the part of his mind where he kept things that were too heavy to examine. Before noon. "The work is straightforward," he said, moving a stack of journals off the only other chair. "Sweep, organize, keep the glass clean. I'll show you what not to touch. Some of the reagents are volatile, and I'd rather not explain to the City Watch why my shop is a crater." "How volatile?" "One of them turns to acid if you breathe on it wrong." She considered this. "And the pay?" 8 coppers a day, plus meals." He added the last part without thinking, the way he added most things, automatically, because it was practical. Because a worker who ate was a worker who didn't faint into his shelving. But he saw the way her jaw shifted, the way her fingers curled once at her side and then released, and he understood that the meals mattered more than the coppers. He did not say this. He had enough sense for that. "I can start now," she said. "You can start by telling me your name." "Greyer. Edric." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the shop, at the general state of things. "This is all of it. The mess is honest, if nothing else." She nodded once, already scanning the room again, and he saw her fingers twitch toward the nearest shelf, not to take, but to straighten, to set right. It was the smallest gesture, barely a movement at all, and it told him more about her than any reference letter could have. He turned back to his workbench and his ruined tincture and his cold biscuit, and he did not offer her the biscuit, because he knew with a strange and inconvenient certainty that offering it would make her leave. Instead, he pulled a second one from the tin and set it beside the first. "There's tea in the kettle," he said. "Help yourself." He did not watch her take it. He didn't need to. She arrived before dawn. Edric knew this because he hadn't slept, which was not unusual, and because he heard the footsteps on the cobblestones outside his shop door at an hour when the only other sounds were drunk cats and the distant clang of the night watch changing shift. He was bent over his workbench with a pipette in one hand and a growing suspicion that his latest tincture was more vinegar than medicine when the knock came. Soft, almost apologetic. He opened the door and found Greyer standing in the grey half-light with her sleeves already rolled to the elbow. "You said morning," she said. "I said morning. I didn't say whatever this is. This is morning. This is the rumor of morning. Morning hasn't committed yet." She looked at him with that expression he was beginning to recognize. The one that meant she was deciding whether he was joking or simply odd, and had concluded, probably correctly, that the answer was both. Then she stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which he supposed was fair. He had, after all, given her a key the day before. She just hadn't used it. He watched her survey the workshop the way she had the first time, except now her gaze moved differently. Less cautious, more diagnostic. She was not looking at the mess as a stranger anymore. She was looking at it as someone who intended to fix it. "I want to start with the shelves along the east wall," she said. "Those are my reagent stores. Those are a disaster. They're organized. By what principle?" Edric opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was that the organizational principle was roughly chronological, in the sense that things were on the shelves in the order he had last panicked about needing them, which meant the most critical ingredients were always at the front, and everything else existed in a state of archaeological layering that would have fascinated a historian and horrified anyone else. "Intuition," he said. Greer looked at the shelves. Then she looked at him. Then she reached up and pulled down a jar whose label had been half-eaten by moisture and said, "What is this?" He squinted. "Powdered feldspar. Possibly. You don't know. I would know if I opened it. You would know if it were labeled and shelved properly." She set the jar on the workbench with a deliberateness that felt like a thesis statement and began pulling down the rest of the shelf's contents, one jar at a time, lining them up in neat rows across every available surface. Edric retreated to his stool and watched with the quiet alarm of a man witnessing a natural force rearrange his life. She worked without speaking for nearly an hour. Her hands were careful with the glass, more careful than he expected. She held each bottle the way someone holds a thing they understand to be valuable, even if they don't yet know why. When she found a cracked vessel leaking pale blue powder onto the shelf below, she didn't ask what to do. She found a clean jar, transferred the contents with a folded piece of parchment as a makeshift funnel, and set the broken glass aside in a box she had apparently designated for waste without consulting him. At some point, he stopped pretending to work on his tincture and simply watched. She had a system. He could see it emerging as the shelves emptied and refilled, grouped by type, then by volatility, then by frequency of use, which she seemed to be estimating based on which jars had the most fingerprints on them. It was, he realized with a slow and uncomfortable clarity, a better system than anything he had ever devised. "You've done this before," he said. "No." "Then how?" "It's not complicated." She placed a jar of powdered heat exactly where it should go. "Things belong where they make sense. Most people just stop looking for where that is." She didn't turn around when she said it. She didn't need to. The words landed anyway, in a place he hadn't expected, and stayed there like something shelved precisely where it belonged. She broke the first bottle on her second day. It wasn't even a good bottle. Edric knew this because he'd been meaning to throw it out for weeks. A cloudy thing with a hairline crack running from lip to base. Useful for nothing except collecting dust and, apparently, making a spectacular sound when it hit stone flooring. Greer froze. Not the way a person freezes when startled. The way a person freezes when they are calculating, rapidly, silently. How much trouble they are in and whether the door is close enough to reach before the shouting starts. Edric looked up from his workbench, looked at the shattered glass, looked at her face, which had gone carefully, terribly blank. "That one leaked anyway," he said, and went back to his notes. She didn't move for a long time. He could feel her standing there, could feel the weight of whatever she was deciding. Then he heard the broom, the one she'd found wedged behind the supply cabinet yesterday and claimed like a soldier reclaiming a lost standard, and the quiet, methodical sound of glass being swept into a pile. Neither of them mentioned it again. By the third day, she had developed a system for the bottles. Edric discovered this when he reached for his tincture of valerian root and found it exactly where it should be, which was so disorienting that he actually checked the label twice. She'd organized them by color first, then by size, and this was the part that made him set down his mortar and actually pay attention. By the quality of the glass itself. The clear, well-blown bottles stood at the front of each shelf. The cloudy ones behind, the cracked ones she'd pulled entirely and lined up along the windowsill, where they caught the afternoon light and threw strange little rainbows across the floor that Edric had never seen in 3 years of working in this room. "You sorted these," he said, not quite a question. Greer was on her knees beside the supply cabinet, pulling out what appeared to be a truly ancient packet of dried lavender that had fused with the shelf paper. She looked up, and he watched her expression cycle through something complicated before settling on cautious. "Was I not supposed to touch them?" "No, that's fine. That's what I hired you for." He picked up one of the cracked bottles from the windowsill, turned it in his fingers. "Why these here?" "They're no good for storing things. The cracks let air in." She said this with the careful precision of someone stating something obvious to someone who should already know it. "But the glass is still pretty. Seemed wrong to throw them out just because they can't hold anything anymore." Edric set the bottle back down. The rainbow shifted on the floor, a small bright trembling. "Right," he said. Yes, fine." He returned to his workbench and did not accomplish a single useful thing for the next 20 minutes. She was good with her hands. This surprised him only because he'd been told, by the general ambient prejudice of Ashenvale, by the market vendors who watched orc customers like they were waiting for something to be palmed, by a lifetime of assumptions he'd absorbed without ever examining Moy. That orcs were clumsy with delicate things, built for labor, not for care. Greer's hands were broad, yes, green-skinned and strong-knuckled and scarred across the palms in ways he didn't ask about. But he watched her unwrap a glass stopper from its cloth padding with the precise, unhurried attention of someone handling a living thing, and he understood that whoever had first said orcs lacked finesse had simply never bothered to watch one work. On the 4th day she broke nothing at all, and Edric found himself mildly disappointed, because it meant he had no excuse to say something reassuring, and he was beginning to realize, with the dawning unease of a man who has lived comfortably inside his own silence for a very long time, that he wanted one. She found the window on the 3rd morning. Not that it had been hidden. It sat behind a shelf of amber-stoppered bottles that Edric had pushed against the eastern wall, sometime in what must have been a fit of organizational despair. The shelf was too tall for the space and too heavy to move without commitment, and so the window behind it had simply ceased to exist in any practical sense. Light came through in thin, broken lines, filtered through dust and glass and neglect, and nobody had thought about it since. Greer thought about it. She didn't ask permission. That was becoming a pattern between them. She would do something that made the workshop fractionally more livable, and Edric would notice hours later with the quiet, blinking confusion of a man who had just discovered a door in his own house. She moved the bottles first, one by one, wiping each with the cloth he'd given her, setting them on the workbench in a line that caught what little light the room currently offered. Then she braced her shoulder against the shelf and walked it forward, 6 inches at a time, until the window breathed. The glass was filthy. She cleaned it with vinegar and old linen, working in circles the way her mother had cleaned the one glass pane in their home, slowly, like it mattered, because her mother had believed that how you treated a window said something about how you treated the world on the other side of it. When she finished, the light came in whole. It crossed the workshop floor in a wide, warm band and touched everything differently. The copper instruments on the far shelf turned the color of new pennies. The jars of dried lavender on the windowsill, she hadn't even known they were lavender until now, glowed a faded, dusty purple. The grain of the workbench revealed itself in long, honeyed lines that had been invisible under the flat gray of indirect light. She stood there for a moment, cloth in hand, and just looked. That was how Edric found her when he came up from the cellar with a crate of empty files. He stopped in the doorway. She heard the glass shift in the crate as his arms went still. She turned, and whatever she'd been about to say, something practical, probably, something about where he wanted the shelf now, dissolved when she saw his face. He was looking at the light on the workbench, at the bottles she'd lined up, each one catching and holding a slightly different color, depending on what remained inside. At the lavender. At the window, clean for what she suspected was the first time in years. His expression was not dramatic. He did not gasp or exclaim or set the crate down with theatrical slowness. He simply stood there, and something behind his eyes went very quiet. The way a room goes quiet when a sound you'd stopped noticing finally stops. "I forgot that window faced east," he said. Greer wrung the cloth between her hands. "The light's better for your work. You won't have to burn as many candles before noon." He nodded, set the crate down, walked to the workbench and touched one of the amber bottles, turning it so the light moved through it like something alive. "My partner used to keep these in the window," he said. Said the light helped him remember what was in each one. A pause. "I moved them after he left. Didn't want to keep looking at them like that." She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that kind of sentence. It was not an invitation to comfort, only an admission that something had once been different. He picked up the bottle, held it to the light for another moment, then set it back in the line she'd made. "Leave them there," he said. He returned to his work. She returned to hers, but the light stayed where it was, warm and unbroken across the floor between them, and neither of them moved to close the curtain that she'd also quietly tied back. The rain came on the 6th day and didn't stop. It started sometime before dawn, a steady percussion against the workshop's high windows that worked its way into Edric's dreams and turned them grey and formless. By the time he came downstairs, the gutters along Market Street were running fast and brown, and the air inside the shop carried that particular damp weight that made his joints ache and his reagents temperamental. Greer was already there. She'd let herself in with the key he'd given her 2 days ago, a small iron thing he'd pressed into her palm without ceremony, saying only that he was tired of getting up to unlock the door when his hands were covered in tincture. She'd looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her fingers around it and said nothing, which was the loudest thing she'd ever done in his presence. Now she was crouched by the hearth, feeding the fire with the careful economy of someone who understood that warmth was not infinite. Her cloak hung on the hook by the door, dripping steadily onto the stones. The shoulders of her tunic were dark with rain. "You walked here in this," Edric said. It was not a question. "It's water." She didn't look up. "I've been wet before." He stood in the doorway to the stairs and watched her arrange the kindling. There was a precision to it that he recognized, the same instinct that made her line his bottles by color and height, that made her stack his notes so the edges aligned perfectly. Order as a form of prayer, neatness as proof that someone gave a damn. "There's a room," he said. Her hand stopped. "Above the storeroom. It's small. There's a cot in it somewhere under the things I've been meaning to sort for 2 years. He moved to his workbench because looking at her directly felt suddenly impossible. "It would save you the walk." The fire crackled. Rain hammered the windows. "You're offering me a room." "I'm offering you a dry ceiling and a cot that probably needs new stuffing. Don't romanticize it." She was quiet for long enough that he began measuring powder into a mortar just to give his hand something to do. He'd miscalculated this, pushed too far, too fast. She'd think he wanted something or something. Everyone always wanted something, and she'd learned that lesson harder than most. What would it cost? The question was careful, neutral. The voice of someone who had learned to ask about prices before she allowed herself to want things. Edric set down the pestle. "Nothing." "Things cost, Edric." "Fine. You keep the hearth lit in the mornings so I stop coming down to a shop cold enough to crack my files. That's the price, firewood and a match." He paused. "And you stop walking 40 minutes through weather that would drown a fish because you're too proud to admit you need a place to sleep that isn't slowly killing you." He hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out rough and too honest, and he busied himself with the mortar again, even though there was nothing left to grind. Greer stood slowly. He could feel her watching him. That particular quality of attention she had, the one that noticed everything and forgave most of it. "The cot," she said. "How bad is it?" "Terrible. One of the legs is a stack of books." "Which books? Does it matter?" "It matters if I'm sleeping on your only copy of something." He almost smiled. Almost. "I have duplicates." She crossed the room and he heard her pause at the storeroom door, heard her push it open. A long silence followed, the kind that meant she was looking at the small, cluttered, imperfect space and deciding whether it was something she could bear to want. "I'll need to clear the crates," she said finally. "I'll help. You'll label things wrong. It's my storeroom, and you'll label things wrong." The rain kept falling. Greer started moving crates. After a moment, Edric set down the mortar and went to help. And she didn't stop him, and neither of them said anything more about the price of staying, because the truth of it was already settling into the walls, like warmth from a well-kept fire. The morning she brought the soup, he almost didn't notice. That was the thing about Greer. She had learned to move through his workshop the way water learns a riverbed, finding the path of least resistance between cluttered shelves and precarious stacks of reference texts. He'd grown so accustomed to her presence that the absence of disruption had become its own kind of comfort, a silence that breathed. But the smell caught him, something rich and deep, threaded with rosemary and the particular sweetness of carrots that had been cooked long past softness into something almost confessional. He looked up from his distillation notes. She had set a clay pot on the only clear corner of his workbench, the corner she always kept clear now, the one that used to hold the cold biscuit. Beside it, a wooden spoon he didn't recognize, and a square of cloth folded into a neat triangle. "You didn't have to do that," he said, because it was the thing people said, and because something in his chest had tightened in a way that made more honest words difficult. "I know." She was already across the room, running a rag along the top shelf where the amber tinctures lived. She didn't look at him. "The woman at the market stall on Fenwick Street. The one with the bad knee. I helped her carry stock yesterday, and she paid me in marrow bones. Seemed wasteful not to use them." The explanation was longer than it needed to be. He understood what that meant by now. It meant the thing she'd done mattered to her, and she was building a wall of words around it so he couldn't see how much. He lifted the lid, steam curled upward, and the smell deepened into something that made the back of his throat ache with a hunger he hadn't known was there. "Greer. It's just soup, Edric." "It's not just soup." The rag stopped moving. She stood with her back to him, one hand resting on the shelf edge, and he watched the stillness travel through her. Not freezing, not flinching, but collecting, like she was gathering herself around the moment to keep it from spilling. "All right," she said quietly. "It's not just soup." He ate it at his workbench while she finished the top shelf. It was good. It was better than good. It had the quality of food made by someone who had been hungry enough to understand that nourishment was not merely a function of ingredients, but of intention. Every element had been considered. The salt was precise. The broth had been skimmed with patience. The carrots had been cut into pieces small enough to soften evenly, which meant she'd stood over them with a knife and thought about what she was making and for whom. When he finished, he set the spoon down and sat with the warmth of it spreading through his ribs. "Where did you cook this?" he asked. A pause. "The hearth at Marin's boarding house. She lets me use it before the other tenants wake up, if I clean the grate after." He thought about that. Greer rising in the dark. Greer carrying marrow bones through cold streets. Greer kneeling before someone else's hearth, building a fire to make soup for a man who had offered her nothing but fair wages and a workspace that didn't ask her to shrink. "There's a hearth in the back room," he said. "Behind the storage. It hasn't been lit in over a year. Flue probably needs clearing." She turned then. Just her head, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. The morning light from the window caught the edge of her jaw, the curve of one tusk, the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was safe to want. "I could clear it," she said. "I know you could. Something passed between them that neither named. It sat in the room like the last curl of steam from the pot. Weightless, warm, already becoming part of the air they both breathed. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. And the cold biscuit corner held soup from then on. She found the cup on the workbench before he woke, not on the corner where he usually left things he'd forgotten about, not shoved between reagent bottles or balanced on a stack of notes. It was placed deliberately, centered on the cleared space she'd made weeks ago and he'd somehow managed to keep clear ever since. A small miracle of habit, that. A territory he'd ceded without argument. The cup was full, still warm. Greyer stood there in the grey almost light of early morning, her coat half on, one boot unlaced, and stared at it. Tea. The good kind, not the cheap dried stuff he bought in bulk for himself, but the blend she'd noticed once in the market and mentioned exactly one time in passing. Cardamom and black root and something faintly sweet she'd never been able to name. He'd remembered that. She picked it up, held it with both hands because the morning was cold and because something in her chest needed the anchor. Steam curled between her fingers, and she breathed it in and thought about the word she'd been circling for days now. The one that sat just behind her teeth every time he did something like this. Something small and deliberate, and so quiet, she almost missed it. She drank, slowly, let the warmth trace its way down through her, and tried to remember the last time someone had made her something without being asked. Nothing came. Behind the curtain that separated the shop from his living quarters, she heard him shift. The particular creak of the cot frame that meant he was sitting up. The soft curse that meant he'd forgotten about the bruise on his shin from where he'd walked into the display shelf 2 days ago. She'd told him to move it. He'd said he would. He hadn't. She almost smiled. When he came through the curtain, hair flattened on one side and ink still faintly visible on his left thumb from last night's labeling, he stopped, looked at her, looked at the cup in her hands. Something passed across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who had set something down carefully in the dark and was only now seeing, in daylight, whether it had landed where he intended. "It's good," she said. "It's just tea. It's good tea." He made a sound that wasn't quite dismissal and moved past her toward the stove. And she watched him go and noticed what she always noticed. The way he gave her space without making it feel like distance. The way his hands found tasks immediately, reaching for the kettle, adjusting the flue, so that his eyes had somewhere to be that wasn't on her face while she decided what she wanted to say. She took another sip, set the cup down on the clean space he'd kept clear. "Edric." He paused with his back to her, didn't turn. But his hands went still on the kettle, and that was enough. "I wasn't going to leave this morning," she said. "I know you saw my coat. I was going to the market. For bread." A beat. "I know," he said. But the line of his shoulders changed. Something releasing that he'd been holding since before he came through the curtain. Maybe since before he'd set the cup down in the dark. She crossed the room, not quickly. She was learning that he startled at quick things, not because he was afraid, but because he'd stopped expecting anyone to move toward him at all. She came to stand beside him at the stove, close enough that her arm nearly touched his, and she stayed there while the kettle began its low, familiar whistle. "Your cup's empty," she said. He looked down at his hands. He wasn't holding a cup. "I haven't poured one yet." "I know." She reached past him for the second mug on the shelf, the one she'd washed so many times the glaze was wearing thin, set it on the counter beside the stove. "So let me." He looked at her then, really looked. And whatever he found there made him exhale in a way she'd never heard from him before, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. "All right," he said. She poured.